depended upon its virtue. Taking Washington's advice to heart, the United States attempted to follow a moral foreign policy based on neutrality and isolationism, avoiding foreign entanglements that might draw it into conflict. In the 50 years between the end of the Civil War and World War I, the United States' relationship with the rest of the world would undergo major changes as the nation completed its conquest of the West, created the world's most productive industrial economy, and acquired overseas possessions. Expanding out into the world raised many questions. Should the nation hold on to its traditional policy of isolation and keep the world at arm's length? Should it intervene in other nations' affairs to bring the benefits of democracy and the American way to nations in need? Or should it, like the great powers of Europe, acquire its own overseas empire and join the ranks of the great nations of the world? Today, we look back on the era of American expansion and ask many questions. What motivated the United States to expand its influence into the Caribbean and Pacific? How did the nation treat the people with whom it came into contact? The United States often brought its idealism to its foreign policy, but good intentions were often bound by the prevailing beliefs about race and culture, and American actions and policies at times fell short of Washington's high ideals. Such was the case in the final conquest of the Native Americans as the young nation pushed westward. After the Union victory in the American Civil War, settlers began to pour into the West, lured by offers of cheap and fertile land. There was only one problem. The interior of the continent belonged to large and powerful Indian nations. While white settlers poured onto the prairie, planting crops and grazing cattle and sheep, the American military sought to contain and subdue the Indian nations. Concerned that a war of extermination was immoral, President Grant in the 1870s introduced a peace policy, herding Indians onto reservations, where through education and missionary work they might be indoctrinated into the white way of life. By the early 1880s, conditions on the western reservations had become deplorable. As money meant for Indians was pocketed by corrupt administrators, people on the reservations died malnourished, homeless, and dispirited. The scandalous treatment of Native Americans was so bad that white reformers pushed through Congress their own solution to what had become known as the Indian problem.
For American Indians, a law passed in 1887 would change their lives very dramatically. Congress passed a law that was called the Dawes Act, which tried to break up tribal land and allot land individually to Indian families.
People used to tell me, you look in one direction, as far as your eyes can see. From there, as far as your eyes can see. From there, as far as your eyes can see. In the direction that used to be our land. Now we're, subjected to parcels. And this parcel has been checkerboarded, so we're isolated from one another.
When land was allotted to people individually, rather than held collectively by a tribe, then it really was an attempt to undermine tribal identity, to get Indians to think individually as Americans, not as Arapaho or Cheyenne or Sioux.
The subdivision of tribal lands under the Dawes Act left millions of surplus acres that were sold off to white settlers and investors. The money the government made from the land sales was supposed to finance Indian education. But what would be taught, and who would teach it?
Education should see the disintegration of the tribes, and not their segregation. They should be educated not as Indians, but as Americans. Thomas Morgan, Indian Affairs Commissioner.
But while they were going through that process, they were also detribalized. They were told that their values were not very good, that their way of life was no good, that they had to become Christians, that they had to become members of the white society.
Only generations later would Americans rethink the morality of this final attempt to erase Indian cultural identity. The Plains Indians did not give up without one last effort at resistance. Out in the western mountains, the Paiute prophet Wovoka had a vision that dancing Indians would gain strength from their ancestors and set off natural disasters that would cleanse the West of the white intruders. The ghost dance movement spread across the West, alarming the American military. When groups of Lakotas fled their reservations in the winter of 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry tracked them down, and on December 29, 1890, massacred 300 men, women, and children at a creek called Wounded Knee.
Something else died there. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. Black Elk.
The massacre at Wounded Knee dealt a final death blow to the Plains Indians' way of life. With the conquest of Plains Indians, the long westward march that had begun with the arrival of the first European settlers more than 200 years earlier was finally over. Already the United States was looking for new worlds to conquer beyond its own national borders.
American factories are making more than the American people can use. American soil is producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours.
As Senator Albert J. Beveridge pointed out so boldly, in order to keep growing, America's booming industrial economy needed new sources of raw materials and new markets. In the decades following the Civil War, the United States would expand its trade, its territories, and its influence.
Give me 50, 40, 30 more years of life, and I will engage to give you the possession of the American continent and control of the world.
Back in 1867, Secretary of State William Seward was ahead of his time. When he arranged for the United States to purchase far-off Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, Americans were unprepared for new territories and ridiculed the deal as Seward's folly. Congress only approved the purchase because it expected that Canada would also become part of the United States. The nation pushed next into the Pacific, where it wanted to acquire bases for the booming whaling and sealing industries. The United States' expanding role in the world was motivated by the belief it was serving an important part in improving conditions in what were thought to be less fortunate nations. American missionaries fanned out across Latin America and Asia to Christianize and improve the lives of non-Western peoples. In Hawaii, American missionaries brought schools, medicine, and new farming techniques. Unfortunately, Americans also carried diseases that devastated Hawaii's Polynesian population. American colonists converted the Hawaiian Islands into thriving sugar and pineapple plantations, forcing surviving Hawaiians to work in the cane and pineapple fields. Needing more workers, planters imported cheap labor from China, Japan, and Portugal. In doing so, they created Hawaii's unique multicultural society. The United States also had a growing interest in the affairs of its next-door neighbors in the Caribbean. As the eagle flies, Washington, D.C. is closer to Havana, Cuba than to Houston, Texas. This closeness meant that events in Latin America had a direct impact on American national security. Americans had first established their interest in the region back in 1823, when President Monroe warned Europe against future colonization of the New World. By the late 19th century, American policymakers were using the Monroe Doctrine to insist that European nations respect the sovereignty of Latin American nations. But the European powers paid scant attention to American warnings, for the United States Navy was small and outdated. Concerned about national defense, Congress in 1883 authorized construction of 3 steel-clad warships, the start of a modern, state-of-the-art American Navy.
In the late 19th century, the American Navy became very important because Americans were trying to develop overseas markets. Out of the factories poured more goods than we could consume. So we sought new outlets for all those excess products that our factories produced. And the Navy became the link between continental United States and other parts of the world. And it was a part of our rise in the world as a major nation. We were on our way to becoming the world's most powerful nation. And a nation without a first-class Navy would never be a first-class power.
In 1890, an obscure naval officer by the name of Alfred Mahan published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a book in which he argued that all the great nations in history had gained their power through control of the seas. Mahan gave American policymakers a blueprint for both a consistent foreign policy and national greatness. Congress responded by increasing its appropriations for new ships. By 1907, the United States Navy had 16 first-class battleships, 1 second-class ship, and 5 modern armored cruisers. In 20 years, it had risen from the 13th to the 3rd largest navy in the world. And even before the turn of the new century, the nation had an opportunity to test the strength of its great white fleet. In February 1895, Cuban nationalists once again rebelled against their Spanish rulers. In the course of a brutal and bloody civil war, the Spaniards herded Cuban civilians into concentration camps, where at least 100,000 died of starvation, exposure, and dysentery. Back in the United States, newspaper publishers Joseph Pulitzer of New York World and William Randolph Hearst of the Journal fired off blasts of exaggerated, sometimes false, but always sensational stories to create public outrage, increase the sale of their papers, and force Congress to help the Cuban revolutionaries. A wave of sympathy for the Cubans swept across the U.S. People demanded that the American government do something to help. On the evening of February 15th, the American battleship Maine was resting peacefully in Havana Harbor on a courtesy call to the Cubans. Suddenly, an explosion went off, and the Maine sank like a stone, taking at least 260 American sailors and officers down with it. Although there was no evidence to link the Spanish to the explosion, the American public wanted revenge. Calling for Americans to remember the Maine, the American press called for war. On April 11th, President William McKinley asked Congress for the authority to intervene to end the fighting in Cuba.
In the name of humanity, in the name of civilization, in behalf of endangered American interests, which give us the right and the duty to speak and to act, the war in Cuba must stop.
Negotiations with Spain dragged on until April 23rd, when McKinley called for 125,000 volunteers for military service. The next day, Spain issued a formal declaration of war. Earlier, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, cabled Commodore George Dewey to sail to Spain's Philippines in the event of war. There, Dewey smashed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. Back in the Caribbean, the United States quickly crushed all Spanish resistance. The splendid little war with Spain lasted all of 3 months. When it was over, the United States found itself in possession of an overseas empire, for Congress had also annexed Hawaii and Samoa. Conquest raised many new questions. What, for example, would be the fate of the millions of non-whites now living under American sovereignty? Were the new territories colonies? Could they become states? Were they protected by the U.S. Constitution? The United States would come up with different answers for its new possessions. In the late 19th century, Germany, Italy, and Japan joined Europe's older empires in the rush for overseas possessions. European nations carved up large sections of Africa. England and Germany pushed for economic control over many Latin American nations, while France took over large sections of Indochina. By 1914, more than 80% of the world's land was under European control. Believing that Americans were among the great fighting races of the world, Theodore Roosevelt and other expansionists wanted the United States to keep its newly won territories as part of an American world empire. Many American policymakers were excited about the foothold that the Philippines gave the United States in the commerce of Asia. In order to gain access to the huge Chinese markets, Secretary of State John Hay called for an open-door policy in which European nations would agree to the right of free trade for all nations wanting to do business in China and pledge to respect Chinese independence. At first, President McKinley was unsure about what to do with the Philippines, but after weighing all of the options, finally made his decision.
Take them all and educate the Filipinos, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them, as our fellow men, for whom Christ died.
These sounded like noble sentiments, but what did the Filipinos think of all of this? Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo insisted on his nation's independence and led an armed resistance against the Americans that would continue for 3 years and cost more than 4,000 American and more than 200,000 Filipinos lives. Back home, opposition to the war grew quickly. The Anti-Imperialist League vigorously opposed the war. Their members included such prominent Americans as former Presidents Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and writer Mark Twain. Senator George F. Hoare of Massachusetts denounced the United States for descending from the ancient path of Republican liberty which the Founding Fathers trod down into the modern swamp and cesspool of imperialism.
Imperialism is defined generally as the activities of one society to control the affairs of another. Generally, it can be accompanied by colonialism, actual physical occupation of another society, but it doesn't have to be. It can be simply sufficient political power or sufficient economic power, and often cultural influence, so much that the imperial society has an overweening, a dominant say in what goes on in the other society.
As the Filipino-American War dragged on, atrocities committed by both sides turned the fighting vicious. American troops tortured and killed prisoners, slaughtered whole villages, and destroyed their crops in order to starve the Filipinos into submission. Once the Filipino War ended in 1902, the U.S. government and American missionaries worked to improve the lives of Filipinos, constructing schools and hospitals, and setting up a civilian government. The United States would not grant the Filipinos their independence until after the Second World War. At the end of the Spanish-American War, the United States also had to figure out what to do with islands it had taken from Spain. The United States retained Puerto Rico and Guam, but Americans had no intention of annexing Cuba.
When the U.S. forces left, they left behind something called the Platt Amendment that the Cubans had to adopt into their constitution by force. The U.S. obliged them to do it, or the troops wouldn't have left. That clause gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. So on the one hand, Cuba is an independent country, but it really isn't fully. Here's this clause in its constitution.
By the mid-1920s, the Americans controlled the Cuban economy, and owned 2/3 of all Cuba's sugar plantations, an arrangement enforced when necessary by U.S. troops.
We went down to Cuba, for example, and eastern Cuba found a tremendous resource of iron ore that could be shipped very cheaply up to the United States and used for the further production of steel. We found copper in Chile. We found other mineral resources in other areas and brought them into the United States. So we were looking not just for markets to sell our goods in, but we were looking also for markets so that we could buy raw materials, bring them to our manufacturing centers, and produce more and more of the goods we were producing.
During the Spanish-American War, it had taken the USS Oregon 60 days to steam from the Pacific to the Atlantic. A canal linking the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans would be good for both the American Navy and for trade. When President McKinley was killed by an assassin's bullet in 1901, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt stated his foreign policy in the menacing phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." By big stick, he meant power, and he meant to use that power to get the United States a canal. Strong-armed by the United States, Colombia gave up the province of Panama, which immediately signed a treaty allowing the U.S. to build its canal. Construction of the Panama Canal was a marvel of modern engineering. By the time the canal finally opened in 1914, the Army Corps of Engineers had dug enough dirt out of the big ditch to build 63 replicas of the Pyramid of Cheops. At the turn of the century, the nations of Latin America were in turmoil. Great Britain and Germany had on more than one occasion threatened to take over Venezuela for failure to repay its loans. The last thing the United States wanted was Europe meddling in Latin American affairs. Another nation, the Dominican Republic, had been continually ripped by revolutions since 1899.
I have the same desire to annex it as a gorged boa constrictor might have to swallow a porcupine wrong end too,
said Roosevelt. But by the spring of 1904, he thought he might have to do nothing but what a policeman has to do.
Chronic wrongdoing and the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to exercise of an international police power.
So when Theodore Roosevelt in 1904 created something that became known as the corollary, or the addition to the Monroe Doctrine, it claimed the United States' right to intervene in all the rest of the continent in order to keep order and to prevent what he called wrongdoing. The United States set itself up then as the enforcer, as the society that would decide what the standards were and would enforce them elsewhere.
Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine changed it from a prohibition upon European meddling into a brash promise of United States regulation of the Americas. From 1898 to 1932, the United States sent troops to 9 different Caribbean nations, a total of 34 different times. In the process, small Latin American countries became tied more closely to the United States, both politically and economically. Believing that the infusion of American business dollars would stabilize the Caribbean region and keep Europe at bay, Roosevelt's successor as president, William Howard Taft, pursued a policy of dollar diplomacy, using American naval power and diplomatic pressure to help American businesses move into new markets in Latin America. By the 1920s, the United States bought nearly 60% of all Latin American exports and sold the region nearly 50% of its imports. American corporations, like the United Fruit Company, which became the largest landowner and employer in Guatemala, were powerful forces in many Latin American countries. Today, historians and policymakers continue to debate whether U.S. involvement in Latin America did more good or harm to the region. One school of thought argues that American investors transformed jungles into productive farmlands, built hospitals and sanitation facilities to eradicate disease, and constructed railroads, ports, and schools as they developed the economies of host countries. Others contend that American corporations controlled and exploited host countries by bribing politicians, stealing their natural resources, stunting their economies, and exploiting their people. And in the process, American businesses left a legacy of distrust and hatred for what some Latin Americans call Yankee imperialism. When Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, he wanted to reform American foreign policy as well as domestic politics. Both, he believed, should be conducted in accordance with America's own democratic principles. Wilson opposed Taft's dollar diplomacy as an extension abroad of American monopolistic business practices. He promised the nations of Latin America that the United States would never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest. But as president, Wilson did send American troops into Latin American countries, including Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Mexico. Wilson's intervention in Mexico's Revolution of 1914 antagonized rebel leader Pancho Villa, who in 1916 invaded the United States and shot up the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17. Outraged at the assault, Wilson sent General John J. Pershing and 6,000 troops 300 miles into Mexico for an unsuccessful hunt for Villa and his men. In the years between the end of the Civil War and Pershing's expedition into Mexico, the United States had emerged as a major military power, expanded its trade and territory, and begun to export the American way of life to peoples in both Asia and the Caribbean. A great war waging in Europe would soon draw the United States even more deeply into world affairs. By the early 20th century, the United States had indeed joined the ranks of the great nations of the world.